Actualité. It's off the charts. All evidence points to an acceleration of the planet's record-breaking heat. And so the blame game begins as the COP28 summit opens in the gas-rich United Arab Emirates. A blame game between those who provide fossil fuels, those who consume them, and those in the front lines of desertification and rising sea levels. Now, even before we contemplate binding targets, will the final communiqué even include a pledge to phase out hydrocarbons? Beyond tired scapegoating arguments, there's a more important question. How short-sighted is humanity? Will we all perish tomorrow morning? No. But will we have to pay our food and energy bills? Yes. In Germany, cost is why there's a backlash against policies aimed at phasing out gas boilers, why a quickly scrapped carbon tax sparked France's Yellow Vests movement, why naval-dependent Greece is leading the charge against shipping taxes, which brings us back to the UN Climate Summit in Dubai. In an era where our Instagram feeds encourage us to buy more, to strive for the jet-set life, in an era where nationalism trumps these kinds of global treaties, can humanity find the common ground necessary to ensure its own survival? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking, how do you cut that carbon habit? Joining us from New Delhi, Zarin Oisho, Director of the India Program for the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. Good to see you.
Likewise, Francois. Very nice to see you again, and thank you so much for having me.
Guillaume Compin is Climate and Energy Advocacy Officer for Oxfam France, Oxfam the charity. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Hi.
Philippe Charlet, Energy Analyst for the Sapiens Institute, the Institut Sapiens. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate, where you can react, and you have on the hashtag F24debate. Phase down, phase out. How quickly can the planet cut its hydrocarbon habits? Leo McGuinn has more on the big sticking points coming up at this year's UN Climate Summit.
All smiles for Sultan Al Jaber as he officially began his role as COP28 president on Thursday. One thing he was keen to stress in his opening speech was his country's decision to proactively engage with fossil fuel companies.
We must look for ways and ensure the inclusion of the role of fossil fuels.
But there has been plenty of criticism directed at the 50-year-old. As well as being the UAE's climate envoy, he is also head of the country's national oil and gas company. And earlier this week, he was accused of using the conference to push fossil fuel sales, something Al Jaber has vehemently denied.
These allegations are false, not true, incorrect, and not accurate.
Countries at the talks in Dubai are under mounting pressure to agree to phase out fossil fuels in order to meet the Paris Agreement goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees by 2030. Taking oil and gas out of the ground, processing it and delivering it to consumers accounts for almost 15% of global energy-related emissions. And many critics have pointed out the difference between Al Jaber's words and his country's actions.
The larger issue is the inconsistency between his acknowledgement that we need to cut emissions from fossil fuels by some 40% in the next 6 years, and the plans that his country has to expand oil and gas production to the tune of 150 billion investment over that same time frame.
On Thursday, the UN declared that 2023 is on track to become the hottest year in human history, hammering home the need for urgent action.
Guillaume Compin, it's a bit unfair, isn't it, to single out a country just because it happens to produce oil. He's not. It's, after all, if people are buying it, that's why he's bringing it out of the ground.
Well, I think it's more complicated than that because, of course, there is the demand side, the producing side, and all play a role in the reduction of global emission. which means that countries that rely heavily on oil and gas for their consumption really need to reduce the fastest possible their consumption. But at the same time, big oil and gas producers must have plans to phase out as rapidly as possible from fossil fuel production, and they don't have to keep people buying it through, for example, advertising, through many initiatives that we can see, which really look like false solutions and distractions from the utmost need, which is phasing out of fossil fuel, and fairly, which means global north countries must phase out more rapidly than countries from the global south.
More rapidly than from the global south, yes. As the planet's population grows, so does its energy consumption. Now, the COVID pandemic, you can see it on this graphic, did provide, you see that little dip in oil, coal, and gas. But as you can see, this was a short-lived interlude. Now, Philippe Chalez, it's back to what we had before.
Interesting. I started my career in energy in 1982, and we were at 87% of fossil fuel in the world energy mix. I will be retired end of next January, and we are at 83, so 4% less. So the big question is effectively how to reduce this consumption to satisfy the climate objective. And there are two ways to satisfy. The first way is to reduce the offer. So to reduce the offer is, for instance, to stop any oil and gas development. The problem, if you reduce the offer, you will have an incredible increase of oil price, and we know the effect, of course, in emergent countries, but also in our countries, of the social effect when even the oil price or the petrol consumption increase a little bit, the social problem, it happens. And so the second one is to reduce the demand. And reducing the demand comes essentially from the consumers. And so between the two, you have two choices. Anyway, reduce the offer can be extremely quick. Reduce the demand, it means that it's a social problem in the head of people. And so the reduce of demand is, of course, extremely low. As I told you, because remember that 50 years ago or 40 years ago, 88%, today 82%. And so, unfortunately, the reduce of demand doesn't happen. And the question is why?
Zerrin Oisho, you agree?
Well, I do agree with that, but my discussion or my points would be slightly adding another layer of questions to be asked. The first would be the idea of having these COP meetings. We have the Conference of the Parties going on. We have the Paris Agreement. The question then to be brought about is, why is it when the phase down was agreed to in COP26, the UK, the Glasgow COP, why is it that we have not made a lot of progress, as the gentleman just said? So the question would be to introduce and to understand the concepts of transparency, monitoring, reporting, verification, and how do you actually enforce these targets, which is what is the missing piece right now.
So you should enforce them.
Absolutely, absolutely. But there currently in the system that we have under the Paris Agreement, these enforcement and transparency mechanisms do not exist. They are currently being negotiated. So one of the things to emphasize on in order to achieve the reduction targets that countries have put out, these are all voluntary targets. This is bottom-up approach with very little enforcement, very little monitoring. So the transparency bit is where the prize is. How do you enforce this? That's the question to be asked. And the other thing to also think about is who is bankrolling these projects. So again, 2021, we agreed to having financial institutions, banks, reduce investments on fossil fuel projects. But has it actually happened? And if you look at the data as recent as 2023, earlier this year, a lot of the American big banks still continue to bankroll these projects. So the question is no enforcement plus bankrolling of these projects and the demand continues. So even if the consumer, if we talk about who the consumer is, the question to be asked is, why are we shifting the burden on an individual consumer? How is it that we are not taking large investors, institutional investors, or companies actually to task? Because the idea of making the individual responsible is also a very corporate shift of responsibility and burden. So I think that, in my opinion, would be the two other factors to be added to what the gentleman before
Now,
me
you
spoke.
heard Zarin at the outset, Guillaume, talking about how the pressure has to be brought to bear first on the north and then on the global south. But how much pressure do you put on India, for instance, where right now you have growth that leaves China in the shade? Some saying your country could one day become the world's factory, the way China is right now. But it means coal plants, it means fossil fuels are being extracted for this phenomenal growth. What does it mean, enforcement?
So, in my opinion, countries like mine, India, are still way below the per capita consumption for energy and emissions compared to the global average. So, and it is still in my country's prerogative to provide for the basic energy needed for sustenance, which currently is not the case. We have electrification that we have achieved, but providing energy for all and sustainable energy for all is still a goal that we are working towards. So I think what needs to happen, which India is leading on for most part, is the idea of doing almost 500 gigawatts of renewable energy, and all of the newer plants, capacity additions year on year, have been solar plants. So I think as far as India's future is concerned with regard to making sure that sustainable energy is provided, or emissions from individuals per capita basis are reduced, they're certainly at it. The question should be...
But India is still investing in new coal projects.
Because our reliance is not currently met. Absolutely. We are not yet at the stage where we are able to provide renewable energy. And I think one of the reasons, apart from the others, that is certainty of investments and how do you grow the investments to a scale that is one that will work for India. The biggest problem is our grid infrastructure is not yet up to the mark to be able to handle that many renewable energy, or that mix of renewable energy into the grid. So grid improvement is going to be the next big thing.
Guillaume Compin?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As you said, first there is a need to provide money and investment for the green transition, which means mainly a renewable energy transition, and also guaranteeing universal access to energy. We know that around the world, more than 600 million people don't have access to electricity. This is a big issue. So this should be first and foremost where states should be heading, providing climate finance to those countries who need additional money to fund the transition. And also, as a reminder, countries like India have cumulative CO2 emissions that are well below rich countries such as the United States of America, for example, who have estimated 25% a 25% share of global emission when you take a historical perspective. So since the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question here. How do you measure? I wonder this oftentimes. How do you measure carbon footprints? Because if I have a pen that is, I don't know where this pen was made, I don't know what kind of carbon footprint I have when I bought it. It's whose carbon footprint is it?
Yeah, it's a really complicated issue indeed, because you have the territorial emissions, so the ones that are made and because of the industrial and consumption emissions in a specific country. But of course, you also import goods from other countries or export goods, so you have to make the balance also to know whether the products you buy, for example, in France, are also importing emissions because they've been produced in other countries. So of course, there are different ways to measure it.
Is there a better way to measure it? Is there a universal way to measure it?
there's no universal way to measure it, but in our opinion, it's important to have in mind this the net emissions, which means like the emissions that you export and the ones that you import through your consumption. It's really a better way to measure it, because when you outsource a whole range of your consumption, as is the case, for example, with China, where many rich countries used for the latest decades to have factories and many factories being outsourced to China. So of course you raise China's emissions, but in the end it's Western consumers mainly that use it. So you have this this difference that should be taken into account.
Philippe Charlet, again,
Yeah,
you talked to us about 1982. Are we better at measuring how much we're burning fossil fuel and who's burning it?
First of all, about the founding, because there was two questions: first founding and then emission. So about the founding, there is a very interesting work which has been done by the American economist Nicholas Stern, and Nicholas Stern has estimated that to pay the energy transition from the emergent countries, it would need a transfer of $2.5 thousand billion per year.
2.5 trillion.
So 2.5 trillion per year from OECD country to emergent countries. Today we are in the range of 100, and even 100 we have difficulty to reach 100.
But there is good news. But hold on that point. There is good news in that this climate summit has opened with a deal on using the World Bank as the conduit for that funding.
Let's take the 2.5 trillion. 2.5 trillion is around 4% of the GDP of the OECD countries. So which means that if you accept this deal, which appears, I don't think that politically it's possible. It means that in fact the OECD countries accept a structural recession in economy to pay the transition of the emergent countries. So this is the I would say the bill to pay. So it's interesting numbers. The second thing about emission, of course.
And that brings us to what I was saying in my introduction. Are we worried about the end of the world or the end of the month?
I think that most of people are still much more worried in the end of the month than in the end of the world. It's obvious in France. Each time you increase a little bit the price of oil, everybody is in the street. It's a reality. I blame it, but it's a reality. The second thing, it's about emission, and effectively it's relatively complex. Two numbers. In France, territorial emission is 6 tons of CO2 per habitant, and if you add the import emission, it's 9, around between 9 and 10. So I would say it's
9 tons per person.
9 and 10 per person. So it means that you have 2/3 around of territorial emission and 1/3 of importing emission. Officially today, the countability is essentially territorial emission, because if you take into account import emission, you have first a risk to count 2 times the emission. And the second thing is that the importing emission, there is a shared responsibility for me between the producer and the consumer. Because, for instance, if you import...
But you just heard Guillaume say, the problem then is that we're basically outsourcing our polluting.
We are outsourcing, but outsourcing in bad condition. Because, for instance, if you import a T-shirt which is manufactured in China or in India, they use essentially coal electricity. So, of course, you import more emission. But on the other hand, there is also a responsibility of Chinese and Indian to manufacture the T-shirt with electricity manufactured with coal. The last point is, I would say, the emission from the past. It's true. Currently, I would say between OECD and non-OECD country, emergent country, it's approximately half on one side. It's approximately half on one side, because today the territorial emission of the emergent countries is 66%, OECD 1/3 and 2/3 in, okay. But the emission of the past, of course, we can pay from the emission of the past. But even if you go in Lourdes every day, the emission from the past will not come back on the earth. So it means that, okay, probably we have to pay this emission, but we will not change anything in this emission from the past. Can you say to a French people that they are responsible of the emission of their parents, their grandparents, and their former grandparents? This is more a moral debate than a real technical debate for me.
Guillaume Compin.
Well, I think I don't agree, because I think that we, like developed countries, rich countries, have also based their development widely on the use of fossil fuels in the past. So if we are living in such good material conditions, it's also because we have used a huge amount of CO2 in the past. And also our countries, when you take the GDP per capita, are really well off, and we have resources to pay for it. But it makes me think about the second point that I wanted to say, that of course there are inequalities in the global perspective between countries, but there are also huge inequalities within countries between inhabitants. For example, 2 weeks ago, Oxfam released a report, Climate Equality, which highlights that when we measure the emissions, consumption emissions of the 1%, the most well-off around the world, they emit as much as the 2/3 of humanity, because many people have a really low carbon footprint, whereas many people who have, for example, SUVs, but also who are able to afford frequent flights.
If we can, let's call up that graph about how much, and it's not a scoop, right? The rich definitely burn more fossil fuels than the poor, but just again, and it sort of brings me back to the question I asked you earlier. How do you measure? Because when you look at this graph, you get to the untrained eye, it looks like the richest 0.1% are polluting much more than those of moderate income, 40% of the population, et cetera. But actually, that's not the case, is it? This is per person, right?
When you take the carbon footprint per person, yes, that's per person by definition.
Just to stress that point, yeah.
Yeah, but the figure about the 1% emitting as much as 2/3 of humanity is not per person. It's a global. It's a total amount of emissions, not per person, by group of people.
Right.
I don't. Can you show the numbers again?
All right, we can ask our producer Alessandro there to show up. Many thanks, Alessandro. There.
I would say that I am in the 0.1%, 0.1% of the world. You agree? It's absolutely impossible for me to emit 260 tons of CO2. I made you know probably the ADEME calculation of emissions. Okay. There is a sort of calculator. You enter your way of living, and it calculates your emission. I enter my way of living, and I emit between 12 and 13 tons of CO2 per year. So I can't understand, except if you add what is called in the World Inequality Lab, when they take into account what they call financial emissions. So it means that if you own some share, for instance, of oil companies, then they add emission, and in that case, of course, you add. So do you take into account in that calculation the financial emissions or not?
In this calculation, no, but I think you showed about the 0.1%, right? The carbon footprint. I was talking about the 1%. So, of course, when you take the 0.1% of the population,
but even the 10% of the richest people in the world is half of the French population. Yeah. So it means that half of the French population would emit 23 tons of CO2 per year.
So
which
Zeren
means
Oysho,
that you are much above the 9 tons per people. So I would like to enter in more detail in your methodology
Zeren Oysho,
to arrive at this number, because it's very important. When you accuse I would say the 10% to emit more than the half of the population of the world, of course, I would like to understand how you can reach such a number.
I think I can. Yes, thank you so much. I think,
sorry.
sir, I can explain or offer some explanation as to why the 1% is the sort of sum whole of more than 25% of the global emissions. So the Oxfam report actually delves deeper into breaking the 1% emission into 3 factors on how they're producing that bulk of emissions. And the 3 explanation the Oxfam report goes into, the first one being lifestyle or per capita emissions, which is basically, and in fact, this was big on American news very recently about how Hollywood stars and the superstars were flying in private jets. So the first explanation of what the 1% emissions influencing the 25% of the global emissions looks like, the first was lifestyle expenses. The second was the access of those 1%, the ultra uber rich of the world, having had money and financial investments placed in Exxons and BPs and Shell, which are commonly referred to as grandfather shares, which basically mean that once you retire, you have access to that pool of money coming to you because those are safe investments. You always make money of those investments. And the third factor on how they produced the bulk of it was their access to policymakers and politicians. These are the 3 factors that the Oxfam report explicitly mentions in how the 1% is relevant or responsible for the 25%. And Francois, particular to the point that you're making about how do you calculate these emissions, right? One of the things that we should understand is, where did the concept of carbon footprinting come to begin with? It was a concept that was first initially pushed by oil and gas companies. And the idea was, how do you shift the responsibility of being accountable or responsible for emissions from us as companies, fossil fuel companies, to individuals, which is why now you see more and more of these apps that we use on on a daily basis, Ubers or food delivery apps that say, would you like to pay X dollars, X euros to offset your carbon footprint for this delivery or for this service? The question should be, even if you look into the carbon footprinting scales as a whole, it is a flawed concept. Because if you go to America, you will have a huge discrepancy in the carbon footprinting of the 0.1 or the 1% versus somebody who doesn't come from a very strong financial background. So I think the carbon footprinting is mostly dependent on your financial and social status in society.
So Zeren, in your revolution, what you talked earlier about binding rules. What would be your binding rule number 1?
My binding rule number 1 would be, how do you account or hold accountable in terms of transparency, in terms of monitoring, reporting and verification, large companies and countries for their emissions? So just to give you an example, COP28 is going to be a big COP to discuss methane emissions. It's the hottest topic that is going to be discussed among the more important ones of the global stocktake and the loss and damage fund. And one thing to keep in mind is that developing countries or the global south will, including India, have decided that they're not going to support this pledge because methane constitutes a survival emissions for countries like India, where we have very small holding lands and farmers. But does that mean that methane is not important? Absolutely not. It is the most important we can do in terms of mitigation in the short term, and it will reduce the human cost of climate change and the growing extreme temperatures and weather events that we are witnessing. So how is it that we can use this opportunity of COP28 to hold oil and gas companies responsible? It's ADNOC. They are the president. Sultan Al Jaber is the head of ADNOC as well. Is there a possibility for us to get a deal on methane waste gas from the oil and gas sector? I think that would be the question to ask. How is it that we can zero down on multi-billion profit-making companies that just grow in profit year on year without any accountability. So that would be, in short, my ask.
And so, again, at these summits, and we have it every year, COP, and we have this conversation every year, it's the world's largest economies that drive the conversation, that reach the kind of deals you're talking about with methane, and with the likes of the US, China, Europe, Brazil, Indonesia front and center at the recent G20 that took place where you are in India's capital. Note that there the final communiqué talked about a phase down, not a phase out of fossil fuels. Didn't even talk about specific targets. So, Zeren, what are you expecting from this summit realistically? What's the best we can hope for?
I think the best we can hope for is a deal on cooling. So one of the things that is supposed to be announced at this COP is going to be a pledge, a global cooling pledge. And if we get the pledge and if you're able to do what the pledge talks about, which is universal ratification of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, we're already, if we fast track Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol adoption, we're looking at 0.5 degree reduction in targets, plus improvements in energy efficiency gives you a double of that saving in terms of climate benefits. Another one would be the global methane pledge/agreement. If we have enough and more oil and gas companies, especially the national oil and gas companies from the GCC countries, we're looking at short-term mitigation, near-term climate mitigation benefits. And then, of course, following from there would be the GST, the global stock take, which is going to tell us essentially what the pledges were under Paris, where we are, and what does that gap look like. And once the technical analyses have been done on that gap, it becomes easier for policymakers to understand where and who needs to put up more and more ambitious climate action plans. So that would be my takeaways.
That would be the first place you'd look. Now, these COP summits, by the way, they rotate among regions. It happens to be the Middle Eastern. You mentioned ADNOC, the fact that it's the head of the Emirates national oil company. Its boss is the chair of this COP28 summit. UN Secretary General saying if you're negotiating over fossil fuels, well, it's better to have an oil man in the room.
I think he is in a better position to tell that to his colleagues in the fossil fuel industry than if he was member of an NGO with a very solid pro-climate record.
You buy the argument, Guillaume Compin?
Well, it's complicated. I think that, of course, we need everyone around the table, but that's for sure a risk of conflict of interest. I mean, we've seen in the news also that there is this temptation to make oil deals and so on. But
do you agree with Zeren's hopes? Is that realistic to hope for the oil and gas sector agreeing to, again, capping these methane emissions, capping the burn off?
Well, there are two things. I think there is a realistic hope that we will gain pledges on methane emissions from the oil and gas, and it's a good thing. But their methane emissions amount to like 15 or 20% of the whole amount of emissions linked to fossil fuels. So most of the fossil fuel emissions come from their consumption. And so for that, we need to reduce the overall amount of fossil fuel. And it doesn't matter if, it's not only dependent on methane. Reducing methane is good, but of course, we first need to reduce consumption. And it also goes with transition plans, like phasing down first fossil fuels and then having a clear target to phase out as rapidly as possible. And that's why countries such as France, for example, who have an energy mix which is not as much dependent on fossil fuels as other countries, should lead the way. And this is what we ask also in France, that we have really binding targets that are ambitious and that will pave the way to show other countries we managed to be independent from fossil fuels. So you can tell we are producing fossil fuels because you need it. No, we don't need it anymore. So yeah, rich countries like France should have clear targets like for 2030, 2035, saying, okay, this is the trajectory that we plan for our oil and gas consumption.
If they're looking worldwide, does that mean, like, for instance, asking state oil giant Total to accelerate it's a private company, but it's French, to accelerate its transition to renewables?
Yeah, of course, it also goes through this. So first, we need legally binding plans by fossil companies and all polluting companies to not only pledge that they will be carbon neutral, but to have really clear transition plans out of greenhouse gases emissions with specific dates and investment plans to do that transition. And of course, that goes with investments in renewable energy, in energy efficiency. There are a lot of markets for these fossil giants to transform themselves and to invent the future. And this goes through renewable energy, and they can do it. They have the money for that.
Philippe Charles?
Yes, several things. First of all, I agree with you. The methane is one thing, but you have to know that the main emission of methane doesn't come from oil industry, but come from agriculture in general. Are
you eating less beef?
The emission from methane in the oil and gas industry essentially come from leaks in the transportation of. But it's 1%. It's not so huge. So the main problem is CO2 and not methane on that point of view. The second, on the agreement of country. Unfortunately, the COP28, if you remember, was in the spirit of a relatively multilateralist world. So it means that all the countries were relatively in line. There was not a conflict as today. And unfortunately, we evolve again far from a multilateralist world, and we go to again blocks.
But we saw recently, we had the Chinese president who met with his U.S. counterpart. A lot of the discussion was preparing for this COP28 summit. They are huge rivals. They're huge rivals these days. But do you feel as though it's both in their self-interest to get along on this topic?
It's interesting to hear the speech of Xi Jinping at the BRICS meeting end of September. He pronounced 30 times the word development, not one time the word climate. So it means that in the spirit, and I'm interested to know about our Indian friend, if really in this country the priority is climate or is still development.
Zarin Oicho?
Yes, absolutely. I think the priority for India is going to be sustainable development, very much development, but in a sustainable way, which is what Prime Minister Modi has said over and over again. But what I want to actually counter one of the things that the gentleman spoke about, which is CO2 being the main problem. I respectfully disagree with you, sir, because CO2, we now have science to prove. And the last paper that was published on this, proving this demonstration, was one in the proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences by Dr. Gabriel Dreyfus, which talks about how if tomorrow we switched off all sources of carbon dioxide, even then we would be past the Paris Agreement 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade targets. I think it's very important to understand the role and the reason why I'm talking about methane and other short-lived non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, because now we have models that prove conclusively that you need to do a dual strategy needs to be adopted. One, where you do CO2 mitigation 100%, absolutely, very important in the longer run, which is why you have the net zero emissions plans put out by countries. But in the near term, it is absolutely important that we reduce and phase out our short-lived non-CO2 gases, which is why methane becomes important, because short-lived climate forces produce 50% of the climate problem that we have. So we need to do both.
I think I agree with you, and I think that methane is much more easy than because leak of methane or transforming the agriculture and essentially alors l'élevage, je sais pas comment on dit.
Absolutely, sir. In fact,
the cheptel of cow and so on. This is really the big source of emission. So by changing a little bit our way of living, we can eliminate the methane. It's much more difficult, again, for the CO2 because of the mix. Of course, the decreasing of fossil fuel is very important, and the quicker the better. I agree with you. But the problem is that we are to face, even in France, two social problems, and we cannot escape if we reduce the production of fossil fuel to an increase of price. And a good way of discussing is that until which level the people will accept this increase of price.
Zeranosha, what's your religion when it comes to this idea of carbon capture, that somehow there can be sort of a way for us to keep on with our globalized way of consuming while at the same time offsetting the CO2 we emit?
So, my personal belief is that I don't believe in it very much, because it's saying that, oh, let us kill the planet and then we'll figure out about a solution, because none of these technologies have been proven or tested as being one that will, be used without any repercussions. What I do want to say is, what we can do today is to stop the emissions. And like Sir said, it's not going to be easy. Absolutely not. But one of the things that we miss in, the climate, the politics of climate negotiations, the politics of war, the politics of finance, is tipping points and feedback mechanisms. So what happens with the Earth, our planet, is that there are different tipping points, meaning that once you tip that because of the global temperature rise, there will be irreversible damage to the planet. And one such tipping point is the Arctic, the global north, the North Pole. We are putting in emissions from shipping, from oil and gas, from fossil fuel industry, which is producing black carbon emissions. And that is making us lose the Arctic sea ice. If we lose the Arctic sea ice, which we are currently on the trends to lose for all summer months, and if we entirely lose that, we will be adding carbon dioxide emissions worth 25 years cumulatively into the atmosphere. So I think what becomes important is to understand how do you stop these tipping points from tipping, Arctic being one.
And yet each special interest wants a carve out. I'll give you an example. 7 southern European states sent a letter in the last days urging Brussels to pause plans to include shipping in the EU's emissions trading scheme, according to the Financial Times. The letter said the move risks, quote, driving business away from European ports while offering limited environmental benefits. Guillaume Compin, everybody says, it's kind of like, the old adage about the French, we want communism for everybody else, but capitalism for ourselves. Everybody wants a special exception.
Of course, that's the politics, the geopolitics.
Is it geopolitics or is that just human nature?
I don't know. I don't have a very clear opinion about human nature in general. But what I can say that, of course, it's part of politics that states are favoring their preferred options. But we are able to.
And will they get that carve out when it comes to a shipping carbon tax?
I think what we think at Oxfam is that we need polluter-pay taxation. It's really important. So a tax on carbon emissions of transportation, maritime transportation, is needed, but it has to be progressive.
Yeah, but we're going to pass it on to consumers, they say.
Yes, that's the thing. So, of course, you have to have fair measures that guarantee that especially southern countries are not too much impacted by these taxes. And that's why we favor other types of taxes. For example, on windfall profits of global enterprises that have made huge windfall profits these last years through the soaring of energy prices, for example. We can tax this windfall profit. We can also tax the wealth of the very little part of the population that is polluting the most, as we said previously. And this is not impacting the average consumer because we tax wealth. And also what we recommend as Oxfam is to have a top-up on the carbon emissions related to wealth, which means you tax wealth, but you tax less wealth if the wealth from the richest people comes from green industries and green transition. But if you invest more in in, for example, oil and gas companies, and you make a lot of money out of it, then you will be taxed more. This seems to us to be much more fair than taxes on consumers, and I agree that it can lead to social unrest. We saw the yellow jackets in France, so we are really clear about that. We don't want to have taxation that is unfair, but we have many options to raise money and to favor the green transition.
One final question, I'll put it to all three of you very briefly. Beginning with you, Guillaume. Remember Greta Thunberg, she said these summits are blah, blah, blah. Do you think a summit like this one is blah, 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 or are you expecting more?
I think COPs are a mix of both worlds. You have the world of blah blah. It's clear that there is also a show about many countries and companies saying they will do a lot, and when you look at it, no, they don't do anything. But you also have the negotiations, for example, about climate finance, which is really, really important, which is a key of the climate negotiation, which means that developed countries have committed to give money through international cooperation to help developing countries face the climate emergency. So, and through COPs, you really gain a lot of good change in these relations. And for example, today you had the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, and I think it couldn't happen without COPs to funnel specific money to developing countries to cope to climate catastrophe.
We're out of time. Philippe Chalez, good thing to have these COP summits?
I think that unfortunately the 27 last COP didn't show a lot, and again I'm afraid that the new world in which we are will not really improve the situation.
Okay, so that's a thumbs down.
There is a first good test, is that Biden will not be there,
right.
Xi Jinping will not be there,
but
Putin will not be there.
But Emmanuel Macron and Narendra
there.
Modi will be there. Zeren Oishov, we're out of time. Are you happy the COP summit is happening?
I think I agree with the earlier sentiment, which is that it's a mix of blah, 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 and it's a mix of a lot of good things coming out of it. And of course, with the growth of multilateralism and number of hegemons coming into the picture and multilateral climate agreements being placed, I think there is scope for those multilateral agreements on the sidelines to have impacts on what COP negotiations look like.
Right, even if it doesn't make it into the final communique. Zeren, I want to thank you so much for staying up late to join us from New Delhi. I want to thank as well Guillaume Compin, Philippe Chalez. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.